And he gives us an example of this. He uses the example, we call it the serpents. And the way that fear of snakes has become a part of our art, and it's a part of our culture. And I think this is a good example for a number of reasons, and I like to talk about it this way. He has introduced us to the idea that we have that there are these epigenetic rules or epigenetic patterns. And what he means by that is that there are these inheritable mental biases that we have for behavior. So they predispose us, these epigenetic rules presuppose us to respond or behave in certain kinds of ways. And that fear of snakes is certainly underwritten by these epigenetic rules, and underwritten because snakes are lethal. And most mammals have learned that if they're to survive. They've learned to avoid snakes. An example of this, and other kinds of testing that sometimes I'll mention, is a study that I was aware of that took place at the University of Chicago some years back, in which they took monkeys, baby monkeys, that had been raised in captivity, and showed them on a screen, and then they had them wired and so on to assess their responses. Showed them on a screen this field, and then they would splice in certain objects, images, that would arise from the field, and then see how the monkeys responded. And so they'd have a bunny rising up, and their responses were fairly normal and unexcited. And then they had a snake rise up, and the monkeys all panicked and showed a kind of fear response and a rushing of adrenaline. And these are monkeys who have never seen snakes. And they're monkeys who had been raised in captivity and so had never been taught to fear snakes. And so the explanation can only be that in some ways fear of snakes is heritable, which makes sense in terms of natural selection, because those who have a fear of snakes and avoid snakes will live longer and so reproduce, as opposed to those who have no fear of snakes and will just take hold of one. So human beings have the same sort of predilection, and that doesn't mean that everyone will fear snakes equally or everybody's going to be horrified by a snake. What it means, though, is that we're much more likely to fear a snake, even as a child to fear a snake, than we are a kitten or a rabbit. In part because it's part of those epigenetic rules. He says this starts then to affect culture, and by culture, our language, our arts, the stories we tell, and so on. Again, the example that I like to suggest is this. I'll ask to get an idea of two different worldviews. If you are a biblical literalist, that is, that you read the Bible, you read Scripture as literally true, as historical fact, why is there a serpent in the Genesis story of the fall? So if you're a biblical literalist and you're asked that question, why is there a serpent in that story, your response might be because that's the way it happened, because there was a serpent in the garden that seduced Eve to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. If you're coming at it from another point of view, if you're coming at it from an empiricist point of view, like like Wilson, you would say that there was a serpent in the story of the seduction and fall, because we already have an inherited distrust, a propensity to distrust and fear snakes, and that then becomes a metaphor, becomes a symbol, an icon in our artwork and in our stories. Hence the seductive and crafty serpent. So this becomes an example of the way that biology, these epigenetic rules, began to inform culture and then move back and forth. The stories he's interested in, the way we talk about things, the narratives, because the thing that separates us from all other animals is our ability to acquire language. And you recall this section when he talks about other primates. And while they seem to be able to acquire language, they cannot acquire language at the same rate that human beings naturally do, and they can't invent language in the way that human beings naturally do. And their use of tools, they seem to work with tools primarily in a kind of imitative fashion. And so what he's suggesting is that there are certain points of culture that are peculiarly human, and that they're all tied in some ways to not only the development of culture, but our biology. We have certain kinds of predispositions then that affect the way that we construct culture, and that culture reinforces. He'll suggest a little bit later, not only are we language-making beings, but that we tend to be audiovisual beings. We make sense of the world in terms of our sight primarily, and in terms of hearing, the language that we use. We focus on faces for the most part. Some of that bound up in just simply, the development, say, of an infant's sight, which can only, for the first couple of weeks, can only see about 18 inches with any clarity, which is just about the distance between the crook of a mother's arm and her face. And so we know that babies focus a great deal upon faces. We tend to be, we have a part of these epigenetic rules that is our impulse toward reification, which means simply to make concrete abstract principles, in part in order to make sense of them. And so that coupled with what he also says as part of this, a binary impulse. So we tend to see the world in terms of binary oppositions or dualistic systems, this or that, black and white, good and evil, and so on, helps then to create the kinds of stories that we'll tell and the way that we make sense of the world. The example that I like to use to make sense of that is one that I'm sure many of you have seen. It was on it ran on the web for a long time, but you recall after 9/11 there was a photograph that appeared. The photographer had been in another building and he was taking shots of the towers, the Twin Towers, and the smoke that was billowing from those windows. And there seemed to be in one the shape and face of Satan. And so the question comes, is why do we see the face of Satan in the clouds coming from the Twin Towers? And one response, which would be part of the way that culture works in a kind of natural way that we want to make sense of things, is that, well, one, we're likely to see faces more than we're likely to see other things. We have a proclivity to do that. Two, because we tend toward reification, that is to make concrete abstract principles. And so the abstract principle or abstract idea of evil becomes manifest in something concrete like Satan or like the devil. And that being related to this binary impulse that we see evil up against good. And all of that then informs our wanting to see the face of Satan in the clouds, because it helps to explain what happens. This is simply an act of evil, that it was the doing of Satan in one form or another. Culturally, that's how we make sense of it. That's what we're given to. He would say, though, that's not what's really happening. What's really happening has to do with those epigenetic rules and how we're in some ways predisposed to see and hear and to make sense of the world in precisely that way.